So there's lots of questions that have been coming in about feedbacks and tipping points, unsurprisingly. So this question specifically is from David from the University of Toronto. And David says, there are voices who lead me to think that we are all but guaranteed unstoppable and apocalyptic heating. But the attitude that our problem is solvable and not just theoretically so inspires me to keep going. Yeah, I know the feeling, thank you. So his question is, how can we reconcile these positions? And is there evidence that it is still solvable? So yeah, Mike, can you start us off on this one?
Yeah, and it comes down to this issue of urgency and agency. Urgency, we're already seeing dangerous climate change impacts. We have to act now. Agency, we can still act. And here, the science actually is on our side. And that's why I'm often troubled by some of these doomist narratives that are premised on distortions of the science, this idea that we're now already committed to runaway warming. The reality is that over the last decade or so, as climate modeling experiments have become more realistic, in the old days, we would treat carbon dioxide as a control knob. And this idea is you just turn it up and the climate warms up in response to that. And when you model the human impact on climate that way, you observe what's known as committed warming, which is to say that the planet continues to warm for decades, even after we stop burning carbon. And that's because of the thermal inertia of the oceans. And so we used to say that even if we stop burning carbon now, the planet will warm up for decades. And so there isn't an immediate impact on our efforts to decarbonize our civilization. The reality is, as we do more realistic experiments where CO2 isn't treated as a control knob, we treat it the way it actually worked. We put carbon into the atmosphere and the climate system determines what happens to that carbon. In the terrestrial biosphere, plants take up some of that carbon. The oceans take up some of that carbon. In fact, collectively, they've taken up about half the carbon we put into the atmosphere. So in those more realistic experiments, what we find is that when we stop burning carbon, surface temperatures plateau pretty quickly. They stabilize within a few years. And that's because while you do have that committed warming effect, the oceans in particular are drawing down CO2 out of the atmosphere. So CO2 is actually coming down. And the net effect is that temperatures sort of stabilize at the level that they're at when you stop burning carbon. That's why we can actually define what's known as a carbon budget. The reason we can say there's this much carbon left that we can burn and keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius is because of that understanding of how it works. And so if you understand if you look at our best scientific understanding of that problem, now what it tells us is that there is an immediate and direct impact of our efforts to bring carbon emissions down. Now, there are some components of the system that will continue to respond for decades down the road. And we worry about, for example, the collapse of ice sheets and the sea level rise that entails. We may be committed now to substantial loss of ice from the ice sheets and sea level rise, and ocean acidification will continue on as well. So I don't want to be Panglossian here. There are some damaging long-term impacts, but the warming of the surface of the planet and all of the impacts connected to that really do stabilize fairly quickly if we stop burning carbon. That's why we have to stop burning carbon.